go ahead and get started here. I know some people have class at 4:30, so if you need to step out, just feel free to do so. Just be mindful of people around you. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first event of the year where temperatures are above freezing, so it's kind of nice springtime. We have two very distinguished speakers today for our event on campaign finance and disclosure laws. And we're excited to have them here. There's a couple new faces that I don't quite recognize, and I'm glad you are here. This is your first event. Thank you. A little bit about the Federalist Society. The Society is a nonpartisan, conservative, and libertarian organization dedicated to freedom, federalism, and judicial restraint. The Federalist Society seeks to educate the legal community through its programs and publications about how limited constitutional government based on the rule of law can have a positive effect on law and public policy. Our national membership is over 40,000, and that includes lawyers, judges, professors, students as well. We have a couple of members on the U.S. Supreme Court as well as the state Supreme Court here in Minnesota, so you're in good company if you're in the Federalist Society. We take no position on any legal or public policy issues, but rather we feel that an open debate or discussion on the issues is just a better way to grow intellectually. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Professor Raleigh Levine. Professor Levine started here at William Mitchell in 2001. She also taught at Columbia Law School as well. She specializes in First Amendment law, media law, and election law. Professor Levine has worked for CNN, the ACLU, and was a clerk for the Honorable James Browning of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I'll make a quick plug for Professor Levine's election law class. I just finished it last fall. It's a wonderful class, and thankfully they're going to offer it again next spring for 3 credits. So if election law, campaign finance, voter ID, redistricting, if any of those issues interest you, I'd highly recommend taking it. Now it's offered for 3 credits instead of 2, so it's a little bit more incentive. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Professor Levine.
Same workload, 3 credits.
Oh, bad.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and the format for the event. Gary Goldsmith is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. He spent 11 years in private practice before beginning a career in public service, first with the Minnesota Historical Society, and he's going to give us a historical overview of campaign finance disclosure. And he's currently the executive director of the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. And that board was established by the Minnesota legislature in 1974. Its mission is to develop, administer, and enforce disclosure and public financing programs. The board has 6 members who are appointed by the governor on a bipartisan basis for staggered 4-year terms. Mr. Goldsmith has served as the board's executive director since 2007, representing the board in its work with the legislature and the governor's office. Professor Raleigh Smith is currently teaching at the West Virginia University College of Law. He is also an elections expert, is a former chair of the Federal Election Commission, on which he served from 2000 to 2005, the final year as the chair, your panelist right there. Yeah. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School, and he's currently the Josiah H. Blackmore II and Shirley M. Melt designated professor of law at Capital University Law School, but as I say, he's currently teaching at West Virginia. One of the nation's leading authorities on election law and campaign finance, having written too many for me to even count books, book chapters, and law review articles on those subjects. So we're going to start with opening remarks first from Mr. Goldsmith and then from Professor Smith. And then if something Professor Smith says sparks Mr. Goldsmith's interest, he may respond to those comments, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and possibly to the panelists to pose questions to each other. So after the formal remarks, we'll turn to a relatively informal format for making the ask questions. Okay. So we'll start with Mr. Goldsmith.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm really outranked by the professors and election law experts and constitutional law experts that are here. I'm a state government administrator. I'm a bureaucrat. I do have a law degree and still maintain my license and do practice law for 11 years, but none of that had to do with election law or constitutional law. In fact, My recollection of law school is much like constitutional law class, which really has probably the most bearing on campaign finance disclosure regulation. I don't think we even had an election law class way back when I was in law school. But nevertheless, for Minnesota, at least in the legislative context and in the context of people who are regulated by the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board, I am considered an expert, and I'm the chief advisor to the board on all matters that come before the board, including those that relate to campaign finance and First Amendment rights as well. I do want to start today by taking about 10 minutes or 12 to give you some historical background to explain where Minnesota is, which sort of parallels where the federal government is, but I speak from a Minnesota perspective, to explain where we are with respect to campaign finance regulation, how we got there, and then after that I want to talk a little bit more about the board and where it's going, or urging the legislature to go, including this year, and talk about what's going on in the legislature right now and the difficulties and opposition that an agency like mine faces in trying to advance a policy bill like a disclosure bill. As you know, and most of you are members of the society, so you're quite familiar with the Constitution, and in particular the First Amendment. Most of what we talk about when we talk about campaign finance regulation goes back to the First Amendment, which was finally adopted by enough states to become law in 1791. And the part that we're really talking about is that part that relates to speech, and when you eliminate the words that relate to religion and other things, it just says this: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It sounds fairly simple at first, although the courts have recognized that the freedom of speech is not exactly defined, and maybe that's why we now have speech, money being equated to speech, and why we recognize that some burdens on that freedom are going to be permissible. Of course, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed. That was one of the Reconstruction amendments where the federal law was imposed on the states because some of the southern states were kind of balking at giving their citizens all of the rights that the federal government prescribes. And so the 14th Amendment extends the First Amendment to the states. And so in Minnesota and every other state, when we talk about state laws that regulate speech and thus campaign finance laws, we have to look at all of those laws through the prism of the First Amendment and the jurisprudence that interprets that amendment over the years. You know, there have been efforts to regulate political speech probably since political speech existed. Way back in 1905, President Roosevelt recommended to Congress that it pass a law barring any kind of federal contribution or spending that was somehow designed to influence elections. And the Congress obliged the President with the Tillman Act, barring all those such corporate expenditures and contributions, and 20 states, including Minnesota to this day, still have laws that ban corporate participation in the process of making contributions to candidates and typically to political parties. I'll talk about Citizens United, which pulled back on that somewhat with respect to independent expenditures. Congress passed more laws over the years. Sometimes they were under the guise or name of anti-corruption laws, sometimes just more under the name of regulation. They were sort of brought together finally in 1971 under the Federal Election Campaign Act. That was really a compilation of everything that existed and updated those laws and brought them together. And that act still is the foundation for both the federal law and the law in many states, including Minnesota. What the Congress didn't realize in 1971, when it was passing that law, was that the year before, President Nixon was busy trying to influence elections through a series of slush funds, cash contributions, money being carried around literally on airplanes and in cash. I'm not going to go into that, but if you Google Nixon and Watergate or 1970, 1971 Nixon slush funds. You can read all about what was going on. And so Congress did find out about that, of course, as the Watergate scandal blew up, and it was determined that there was, in fact, a lot of money being passed around outside of the regulatory system, and Congress viewed that as something that it felt was a negative activity it wanted to control. The result was that the 1971 Act was amended and recodified, and was then known as the, it was in 1974 that federal act was strongly amended, and at that time then finally for the first time in the federal government an agency was created to enforce the act. There was no agency before. And at the same time, again we're talking about 1974, Minnesota's Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board was created. At that time actually it was known as the Ethical Practices Board, because with cash money flowing around and sort of buying elections and all unaccounted for, these were looked on as ethics questions. They're not really anymore. They're strictly regulatory questions, and in the 90s, the Campaign Finance Board's name was changed from Ethical Practices Board to Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board to recognize the fact that these aren't ethics violations anymore, they're simply regulatory violations when violations of these various rules occur. Minnesota's law followed the federal law in almost all respects. It was modeled after that law. It did include one component that was a model for other states at the time, and that was public financing of state elections. Partial public financing, I should say. And so in exchange for partial public financing, candidates agreed to limit their spending in various ways. And that's still very effective to this day. However, the 1974 Act was broad, comprehensive, tried to do a lot of things, tried to put in a lot of limits, and it was immediately challenged, actually. And the case that was the primary challenge was Buckley versus Vallejo. If you haven't studied it, study it in election law or maybe in constitutional law, although the recent graduate that I just hired said that in con law they mostly talk about the hidden commerce clause when they get into Buckley versus Vallejo. So we'll have to see what you learn in constitutional law. But Buckley versus Vallejo is the seminal case on what you can and can't do in campaign finance regulation. And it controls, mostly to this day, and it controls the states, including Minnesota. One of the principal decisions in Buckley that really bothers a lot of people to this day is that money equals speech. That's where the concept comes from. The court recognized that money, even back in 1974, was necessary to speak, especially in federal elections where you have much bigger districts, but even in Minnesota where a Senate district covers about 80,000 people, and up in northern Minnesota, that's a lot of territory. You have to have money to reach that many people, particularly in today's markets. In fact, even President Roosevelt recognized that money equals speech back in 1905 when he tried to ban corporate money from entering the political speech arena. So money equaled speech to him even then, although the concept hadn't been stated in so many words. Under Buckley, some types of regulation are okay. Disclosure is generally okay up to a certain point. Some things are particularly prohibited, such as limiting how much a candidate can spend in the candidate's own election, or limiting how much the candidate can receive from contributors combined. Limits on individual contributors are okay. And Minnesota adopted all of those things, and the federal law was amended after Buckley, and Minnesota amended its law to be consistent with the principles that Buckley laid forth. Now, Buckley also had some comments on why we can do these things. Why can we limit things? Why can we require disclosure? And those things have actually been further limited by subsequent cases, particularly Citizens United. But one in particular is still, I think, alive and well, and I think it's probably the basis for what the Campaign Finance Board is trying to do in its bill that it's trying to advance this year, and I'll talk more about that as we move a little bit further into the talk. In order to burden the speech that constitutes political speech, there has to be a valid state interest. You can't prohibit speech completely so as to preclude it, but you can burden it in some ways. One of the state's interests that was recognized in Buckley was to help prevent corruption or undue influence on candidates. Now that's been narrowed further in Citizens United, and I'm not going to get into the technicalities of that. That was one of the reasons. But another reason, which I think has not been narrowed, and in fact I think was enhanced in the Citizens United case, is the concept that disclosure itself provides voters with information about who is trying to influence their votes. And the courts have recognized that an educated electorate, educated about not only the message, but who the message is coming from, is an important valid state interest. And that's the basis, I think, on which the Campaign Finance Board advocates for better disclosure. We're not advocating for more limits. In fact, I'll spend a minute talking about how we lessened and loosened the limits in the last legislative session. So there were a couple of problems, at least for people who want more regulation, more disclosure, that resulted from Buckley. As soon as you set forth a system of regulation and disclosure, there will be groups that try to find ways to avoid it, of course. And there were actually a couple of quite simple ways to avoid the type of disclosure that was recognized in Buckley, because we're talking now primarily about organizations whose purpose isn't mainly political. We're not talking about political parties. We're not talking about federal PACs or Minnesota state political committees, which are the same thing. Everything they do essentially is subject to disclosure. What we're talking about is organizations whose primary purpose is something else. So they're often a 501c4 organization, which is an issue advocacy group. They may even be unincorporated as a Section 527, which is an IRS classification for political groups. These kinds of groups, Buckley said, could only be required to disclose things if those things constitute express advocacy. Because they're doing a lot of issue advocacy, and you don't want to trample on their right to do as much of that as you want. So you have to be really careful about what you're going to try to require disclosure about or regulate. And Buckley said, if it's express advocacy, you can at least require disclosure. And express advocacy in a footnote in Buckley meant speech that uses the magic words, which are vote for, vote against, support, elect, re-elect, and so on. And so Minnesota enacted a statute that defines express advocacy. It actually didn't define express advocacy, but it said you can get disclosure of things that expressly advocate for the election of a candidate or defeat a candidate. Another loophole that was recognized and is becoming more and more popular is something that isn't express advocacy at all. It takes the form of an ad that says, call Senator Doe and thank him for keeping Minnesota taxes low by his votes in the Senate. Or call Senator Smith, thank her for supporting a higher minimum wage. Now, those things aren't express advocacy because they aren't advocating for or against the election of a candidate. They're simply telling you something about the candidate and telling you to call the candidate. Under federal law and under proposed Minnesota law, those things are called electioneering communications. And the federal legislature decided that if those types of communications were published in a certain period, namely 30 days before a primary or 60 days before a general election, we could ask for disclosure about them too. Who's the speaker, and what are the sources of money that's paying for the speech? Because they're so close to the election, they mention a candidate specifically, even though one might argue that they're not for the purpose of influencing the election, they're going to be subject to disclosure. Now, the problem here is that Minnesota didn't keep up. The federal law did two things. Besides recognizing express, besides recognizing electioneering communications, the call center, banking type of communication, in the courts, the federal jurisprudence has also recognized that express advocacy doesn't have to use the words vote for or vote against. If you look at a communication and you can reach no other conclusion but that it's to influence an election, disclosure and regulation can't apply. And that's called the functional equivalent of express advocacy. And in both of those areas, Minnesota didn't keep up. Federal law was moving forward and Minnesota did nothing. So we were starting to fall behind, and that's where we are now, in fact. In order to require disclosure or trigger a registration requirement, a communication by a non-political committee, non-major purpose group, has to use the words vote for or vote against. First, they can do it outside of our system, and we see more and more of that happening. Now comes Citizens United, which holds that corporations can make unlimited independent expenditures. It actually also held that unions could make unlimited independent expenditures, but this is an area where Minnesota has generally been unfair to corporations all along, in that unions have always been able to make unlimited independent expenditures for candidates, or to use union dues for that. Minnesota is also one of those states where a union member does not have to specifically authorize the union to use dues for political purposes. You know, if you think back, Minnesota was sort of this progressive union state. It was a big union state back when these laws were drafted. And so unions have always had that advantage. So to some extent, Citizens United equalizes the playing field for corporations in Minnesota, and it eliminates a worry that I've had in Minnesota for a long time, and that is equal protection. Why do we allow this for unions and not corporations? So that, at least in independent expenditures, that's been removed. Just to sort of bring things to close here, in Citizens United, Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, made some observations when he decided to allow these unlimited union and corporate expenditures, because at the federal level, remember, neither were allowed for independent expenditures. He made some observations about the disclosure systems that were in place that supported opening this whole area up to these types of expenditures, and they are significant and growing all the time. He said a campaign finance system that pairs corporate independent expenditures with effective disclosure has not existed before today, and that's in 2010. Now, in Minnesota, it doesn't exist today, in 2014, and a lot of people would argue that it didn't exist in 2010 either, but his opinion seems to be premised on the fact that this disclosure system exists. He says a campaign finance system that pairs corporate disclosure, corporate independent expenditures, he notes that the restrictions in the previous act were premised on the fact that there would be inadequate disclosure. And again, I'm suggesting that his premise that now there is adequate disclosure didn't exist in 2010, and partly due to the FEC's actions that he doesn't exist now. He says with the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions, and shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporate interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether elected officials are in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests. He's addressing really two things here. One, there was an argument that shareholders ought to have some control or say over whether the corporation uses corporate money for political speech. So he's addressing that. It's not necessary if we have disclosure. And he's addressing the undue influence issue, that if we can see what's going on, then undue influence will be protected or will not result. So, you know, those are the things that Kennedy saw. We don't have them here in Minnesota. We don't have electioneering communications disclosure. We don't have the functional equivalent of express advocacy disclosure. And yet, if you look at the graph of independent spending in Minnesota, you'll see now that, at least in gubernatorial election years, corporate and non-major purpose committees, so non-political committees, In other words, unregulated spending is the highest of any of the groups. Is this really a problem? You know, I'm not Common Cause. My board has the word public disclosure in it, so we believe public disclosure is important. To me, it seems that some people are concerned that, or see the problem as really being that one voice now is louder than another. That's not my board's position. My board simply believes, I think the board's position is that allowing the voters to know who's speaking is sufficient, and if we can do that, then we will have done our job, and citizens can make their own decisions about who to vote for. So I'll spend a couple minutes talking about the board's legislative recommendations and agenda this year, which started last year, and then in the question session, if you want to learn a little bit more about what's actually going on this year and how we get this sort of thing through the legislature, because it's becoming a difficult process, I will be happy to elaborate on that. Well, we have a bill that was introduced last year. It passed the Senate intact last year. It had 3 disclosure provisions in it, all of which were stripped out in the House committee last year. The 3 provisions would be to extend the independent expenditure definition to include the functional equivalent, so those kind of communications that avoid the magic words, but still nobody could say they're anything but election related. To add an electioneering communications provision, so we capture those call and thank you communications 30 days before the primary and 60 days before the general election. Again, no limits on these things, simply disclosure. And finally, I won't go into the detail, but our underlying source disclosure provisions, which is when these corporations use their money, a 50C4 corporation, 501c4 corporation that gets lots of donations, uses their money, there is some underlying disclosure. Under the federal law, as written at least, it says they should disclose every donor of more than $1,000. The board has proposed some different disclosure, but our current law is written in a way that we never know anything about the underlying sources. So we'll see the name of the corporation that did the communication, but nothing about where the corporation got their money. So that's another aspect that we're advocating. So we're moving the bill forward again this year. I again expect it to generally go through the Senate this year. The House again will be a different story. And why, you might ask, is the picture so different in the Senate and in the House? And this is a question that has a simple answer, but it makes me think, and I hope it will make you think, and I haven't come up with really the answer. The reason why the big difference between the House and the Senate is that there's an organization, and it's public, they'll be out there testifying, it's called Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life, the Right to Life Advocacy Organization. And for some reason, they decided to oppose the bill. And they decided to score the bill. And what scoring the bill means, if you don't know, is that an interest group keeps track of votes on bills. The NRA does it, I think the Sierra Club does it, lots of organizations do it. And so a legislature can have a 100% score with an organization or something less than 100%. And with MCCL, there are lots of members in our legislature in both parties, but mostly on the Republican side, who want a 100% score from MCCL. And there are enough Democratic legislators who want that score that in the Senate State Government Finance Committee in the House last year, those provisions were stripped from the bill because we had, even though the legislature now has a Democratic majority, and so in every committee you had a major majority of Democrats, there were 2 Democrats in the committee, plus all the Republicans who voted with MCCL on the bill and stripped the provisions. Now, there's a question about whether the bill is going back to that committee or not this year. If it does, what will happen? And I don't know the answer to that. The question I want to pose, and as I said, I haven't answered it, is whether that sort of scenario is something we should be concerned about. Whether an organization that is strong enough to be able to defeat a bill single-handedly, and yet at the corporate level provides no disclosure, and they do in fact engage in electioneering communications. Whether we should be concerned about that, should we worry about who's really funding that organization, or is it sufficient that we know what the organization stands for? On that same topic, and again, it's a question that I won't exactly try to answer, at a conference at the Appropriate Institute a few weeks ago, a lobbyist for a business organization talked about passing a bill after Citizens United, and it had the business community support. And the lobbyist said, if it hadn't had the business community support, it wouldn't have passed. And again, the question was asked of that lobbyist by the moderator, shouldn't that scare us? That a bill is, that one group, this particular business community group, had enough sway in the legislature to be able to keep the bill. I think they could have if they wanted to. I'm not sure the answer to that is that we should be scared, because everybody knows what these groups stand for, and it may not be that there's anything wrong. But I pose that question. I think it's a question that will be discussed in the legislature as we move through this session and try to get these bills advanced again. I'll turn it over to Professor Smith, and we'll both take questions later on.
That's a great introduction. It covers a lot of technical background. That's very helpful. And I'm going to get into this talk in a minute. I want to ask first, sometimes I'll pretend that this is really happening, especially with an undergraduate audience. They're easily induced, but you probably are not. But imagine, so let's just imagine if this were to happen. Imagine if the federal government were to announce the introduction of what we might call the Patriot II Act. That is a law which is intended to assure that terrorists do not infiltrate our highest levels of government and politics and carry out undue influence on our political system. And so the government passed a law requiring citizens to report their political activity to the federal government. The federal government would then keep records of that in a massive database. That database would be available to government employees, all the various agencies and so on, agencies that give you benefits and so on. But in addition, it would be made available to certain private individuals. It would be made available to companies. It might be made available to law firms that you were looking to get a job with, just to your nosy neighbors, and to most anybody else who wanted access to it. What would you think of that kind of law? Usual response, I guess, people don't think very much about that. I think it's a pretty bad law. And the neat thing about it is that we don't need that kind of legislation. We're not going to have that kind of legislation passed. There won't be a Patriot II Act along those lines, at least. The bad news is that's because we already have that law. And it's called the Federal Election Campaign Act, or at the states, in every state but one, state-level disclosure laws. That's what these laws do. They require you or somebody on your behalf to report a certain element of your political activity to the government, which puts it in a database and makes it available to anybody who just wants to harass you, your enemies, whomever it might be, right? This, I think, is something that we ought to think about. Now, let me ask another question. I'll actually answer it, all right? So we've got an election here, or you've got an election here in Minnesota this year for the United States Senate. I don't know how many of you from out of state or how many of you follow politics closely, but how many people here have a feeling that they know how they will vote either for or against Al Franken? How many people have a pretty good sense? How many of you would change your vote, do you think, based on looking at campaign finance disclosure forms? Okay. The point I want to make in those two little examples is that first, I think that the benefits of disclosure are often dramatically overstated, and the cost of disclosure are often dramatically overlooked. Now, I'm going to focus just on this element of campaign finance. Of course, there's a lot of other debates, and by the way, when we do questions afterwards, or if people want to talk about Citizens United or the backstory of Citizens United, which is kind of interesting. It goes way back to my time on the commission in 2004, anything like that, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to take on anybody who says corporations aren't people, whatever other stuff you got. We can talk about that, right? But for this, I want to just focus in on this idea of campaign finance disclosure. And I suggest that disclosure, like everything in life, should be subject to some kind of cost-benefit analysis, and that, in fact, we have refused to do that with disclosure. There's a broad general sense that disclosure is just inherently a good thing, and there's not really an argument against it. I remember years ago, not that long ago, but a few years ago, there was a move to increase the amount of disclosure in Congress. And I remember talking with a fellow, Mark Johnson, who's now deceased, was the lobbyist for the ACLU at the time. He mentioned that he'd met with some of the sponsors of the bill, and the ACLU was very concerned about this. They didn't like the bill. And one of the sponsors said, I don't see why you're so worked up. We're not talking about regulation, it's just disclosure. Right? Well, disclosure is regulation. It is a form of regulation of political speech, and it can have dramatic impact on people. Now, let's think about some of the questions about the benefits. One of the things we know is that, like most of you say, you know if you're going to vote for Franklin or not. He may not be the typical candidate. He's a little more visible. He's a little more polarizing. People know what they think, right? But most of the time, well, the evidence is quite clear. Virtually nobody actually looks at disclosure information in terms of voters and trying to make decisions. A number of surveys have been done on this over the years, and it simply doesn't happen. Now, that may overstate the case somewhat, because a lot of this information is made available through the press, and people may just absorb it. They kind of know who's behind somebody and who's not, without ever actually looking at the databases. But nonetheless, I think we should recognize that most people aren't really that interested in it. There are lots of people who think that Hillary Clinton is corrupt. There is almost nobody, I submit to you, who will think in 2016 that she's corrupt because of the people who are giving her money, right? They think she's corrupt for all kinds of reasons. That's not one of them. And whoever the Republican nominee is, there are going to be lots of people who think that he or she is also very corrupt. But it is not going to be because of where that person gets their money. There simply isn't much of a connection there. We also know that there's a great deal of many misconceptions in the public about what actually is disclosed now. For example, a great many people, and you read this in the papers all the time, which is why a great many people think this, will hear that super PACs don't have to disclose their donors. Well, they do. It's right there in the law. Plain as day. Super PACs disclose all of their donors, over $200, and all of their expenditures. Right? No, nothing hidden in the super PAC. It's all just thrown out there. Okay? So a lot of things like that, people simply do not realize how much disclosure we have. And the reality is, we have more disclosure now of political activity than we have ever before had in the United States, period. No exceptions. Disclosure now is broader than at any time in our nation's history. And it is substantially broader than it was prior to the 1970s, when, as noted, is when we first got really into this business. Now, I want to suggest to you some ways that the costs are higher than we think. I'm going to start with some mundane ways, and then work up to the really moving constitutional stuff that will get your blood boiling, right? So let's start with the mundane. Some of the claims we have now is that we need still more disclosure. Gotta have more. And someone said, well, what is it that we want more of, right? It's often overlooked, for example, that every broadcast or television ad, right, for politics, discloses who paid for it. Every single one. It's required by law. There's nothing hidden here. You hear all this comes about dark money, that's the phrase that's used all the time, dark money. And that was a bunch of reformers got together, and I literally mean this is literature. They got together, they had a conference, and they agreed dark money was going to be the phrase they were going to use. And that's what they all started calling it, and that's what the press started reporting it as. Okay? And that's, again, not figuratively, that's literally, they got together and they made that decision. What is dark money, right? When somebody buys an ad, it's required, it's always been required, to put the name, the group has to be featured in the ad. Any broadcast ad in this country, right? And that is federal law. So what is it that's not disclosed? Well, people say sometimes, well, I don't know who's really behind it. That is, if the Chamber of Commerce spends money, who's giving money to the Chamber of Commerce? All I'll see is something that says, Chamber of Commerce spent so much money supporting this or that candidate or opposing some candidate. The tricky Chamber of Commerce. What could they possibly be? Just maybe they represent the business. God, that could be, right? How hard is it to know who the Chamber of Commerce represents? Well, we don't know exact companies. Do voters really need to know? Do voters really care? They know if it's a business entity or not. Now, there's some others. I remember years ago when Congress first started requiring certain disclosure of certain types of groups called 527s. The first reports that were filed indicated that one of the major funders of the Sierra Club's 527 was a San Francisco banker named Philip Hambrecht, who'd given tens and tens of thousands of dollars over the years, hundreds of thousands of dollars to various Democratic Party candidates and committees and so on. And I remember thinking, this is really good, because I used to think that the Sierra Club was involved in environmental issues, and now I discovered they're just a front for San Francisco banking interest. Or don't I discover that? Right? How much did that real disclosure help me to appreciate or evaluate any message that comes out of the Sierra Club? Now, the argument then goes, well, there are other groups with spookier names. We don't know who they are. American Crossroads GPS. What's Crossroads GPS? I'm not familiar with that. Are they like the Cancer Society, or are they pushing cigarette manufacturers? Who knows who Crossroads GPS is? I used to laugh about this. In 2000 especially, you'd see all kinds of news stories, and they would read something like this. Crossroads GPS, a shadowy organization founded by former Republican National Committee Chairman Ed Gillespie and Bush advisor Karl Rove to promote business interests. And I'd say, shadowy organization. If they're a shadowy organization, they're doing a really bad job of it, right? This very same sentence just told us who this group is and what it's trying to do, what it's trying to accomplish. How hard is it to evaluate that message without knowing exactly what particular companies might be given money to that particular entity? Now, why does this matter? Some of the efforts now are to get back to these donors, upstream donors, right? In other words, if we have, for example, if a corporation now makes a contribution to a super PAC, the super PAC discloses that the corporation gave it money. Super PACs have to disclose everything. But we don't necessarily know who gave the corporation money. It's a non-profit. If it's a for-profit corporation, it doesn't really matter, right? We know that. But if it's a non-profit corporation, who gave money to that non-profit corporation? A non-profit corporation isn't making money in the marketplace. It's getting money from people. Okay, so who gave that corporation money? Well, that's not necessarily important. And if one of those groups chooses to make an expenditure on its own, it will have to file an independent expenditure report with the government, but it will not have to disclose who gave it the money that it used to make the independent expenditure report. So this is the goal now, is to get at that kind of money. And you'll hear these numbers, by the way, a lot. $350 million, hundreds of millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars. You just hear all kinds of numbers like this. Right? Those numbers are accurate. They're right. It's actually about $315 million that was spent this way in the last election cycle. That is funds that did not disclose who gave the money to the group that spent the money, which did disclose that it spent the money. Sounds like a lot of money, $315 million. Now, if you're talking a lot of serious business ventures, $315 million won't even get you a seat at the table. If you want to talk what it amounts to in the context of American politics, it's a little over 4% of total political spending in the United States. About 4%. All right? So how much should we be worked up about this 40%? Well, let me suggest that efforts to get to that may be more harmful than helpful in a number of ways, and ways that we call junk disclosure, and then they get worse from there. Let's start with the basic notion. Let's take a very real-world example. I've worked on cases like this as a practicing attorney, and many others have as well. We have a group, we'll call it the American Widget. Okay? An American Widget makes widgets, all right? And they're a member of the Widget Manufacturers Association. There's only about a half dozen of those in the United States. It's a fairly concentrated industry. So, each widget manufacturer contributes about $500,000 a year to the budget of the Widget Manufacturing Association. And the Widget Manufacturing Association, in turn, contributes about $600,000 a year in dues to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, in turn, wants to encourage local state chambers of commerce to be involved in politics. So they say to the state chambers, look, if you will spend some money on politics, on some of these races there that are important in your state, we'll match what you raise for that up to, $300,000 in your state or something like that. So the state chamber business raises $300,000, which they raise from a whole bunch of companies. Plus they throw in a couple $100,000 that was just sitting in their general treasury and dues money and so on. And the American Chamber of Commerce matches that, all right? And so now the money is controlled by the state chamber. And the state chamber says, rather than spend it ourselves directly, we're going to go ahead and give it to the State Business Alliance, which is a coalition of the Retailers Association, Manufacturers Association, and the Chamber of Business. Okay? So that group, which is called, Minnesota for Better Days, right? Minnesota for Better Days then spends the money in a race. Okay? What should be reported? Should we hold the American widget responsible, so to speak, accountable for the spending ultimately by Better Days Minnesota? On what basis should we do that? Know that they might have given up the money almost 2 years before. They might have given up the money and paid the money in dues in December of 2012. It's now being spent in October of 2014. Since then, it has gone through several other people for several other purposes, been commingled with millions of dollars of funds. What percentage of it is theirs, who knows? But know what we have. We start trying to peel away these layers. We say, well, we want to know who gave Minnesotans for a Better Tomorrow all that money. They say, so we need to know. So we don't just live ourselves with knowing that they gave the money. Who gave that money? Well, we find out it was the State Chamber of Business. Doesn't tell us anything, does it? Who gave the State Chamber of Business money? Well, we got all these different people. Some of whom gave them money specifically for politics. Some who gave them money for other purposes. Right? Mixed into the batch. Right? That still doesn't necessarily help us a whole lot, does it? Is it really fair, or is it really helpful to voters to think that every business associated with the state chamber somehow gave money to this particular group? The answer I suggest is, I think, pretty clearly not. Certainly no more helpful than just knowing the state chamber spent money, right? So what's the point? If we go back up through the system, is it really fair to accuse American budget of spending? Now let's think further of how this becomes, I shouldn't say accuse, I should say spread, but is that really helpful to voters to know that? Now let's consider another possibility here. Let's consider a wealthy man, we'll call him, I was trying to think of, you pick one of these wealthy donors, Sheldon Adelson or someone like that, right? Let's suppose that Sheldon Adelson, he's the guy who spent like $20 million in the last election giving it to super PACs who were supporting Newt Gingrich or something. Let's suppose that Sheldon Adelson says, it's all fictional, of course, but except for Sheldon Adelson's a real person, but these are fictional events, just so it's clear, I don't want him to sue me. Okay, so Sheldon Adelson decides he's going to spend, who really gets out the vote for conservatives is the Rifle Association. That's really who gets the job done, right? Now, Sheldon Adelson's a big Republican, right? So he gives a bunch of money, $20 million, to the Rifle Association. The Rifle Association spends it on various candidates that they support. Now, the Rifle Association has a policy that they will endorse any incumbent who has a good gun record, right? So they endorse lots of Democrats. They basically endorse Republicans much more often than Democrats, but they'll endorse Democrats who have good records, who are incumbents, who have good records on guns. Okay? So you have a case like in Ohio a couple of years ago in my state, where Ted Strickland, a pro-gun right Democrat, is up for re-election, and the Rifle Association endorses him. Should we now have disclosed by the Rifle Association that this ad supporting Democrat Ted Strickland was paid for by Republican Sheldon Adelson? Leading people to go, what? Sheldon Adelson supporting Ted Strickland? What the hell's going on here? The next thing you know, big shot Republicans are calling up Sheldon Adelson all the time. What are you doing, Sheldon? Right? Is that helpful to voters? Have we clarified anything, or have we in fact confused things? And that's the practical reality when we start trying to peel away these layers. Because you can say we'll go back a couple layers, but how many layers you want to go back? Skilled lawyers will just go in and put more layers in there if they want to actually hide the name of somebody. In the example I'm giving you, nobody's even trying to hide anything. But if you really don't want to be disclosed, you just keep adding layers and layers of companies in between, or organizations in between, and try to peel it back. It becomes increasingly unhelpful. Now, let me go a little bit further at some of the particular problems that might be done here before we talk about why somebody might want to hide that information. Let's think about certain other things. Another effort that's been done lately, and this is not something that I think is under conversation here or anything. I'm talking a lot of this stuff in generic terms. But one push lately has been what they call sort of FaceTime plans, right? They want people to have to actually show their face in the ad. Now, this comes off of the old congressional thing, and you all see it now in ads, right? At the end of every ad, it says, I'm Al Franklin, and I approve this message, right? Or I'm Rudy Boschwitz, and I approve this message. Or I'm whoever, I'm Michelle Bachman, and I approve this message, right? Why is that stupid, idiotic, moronic phrase in every single federal political ad? I mean, isn't that preposterously stupid? Have any of you ever watched an ad from Michelle Bachman and said, I wonder if Michelle supports this ad? And then finally she comes on the screen at the end and says, I'm Michelle Bachmann, and I support that. Oh, thank goodness, right? Of course not. It's moronic. It's stupid. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever, and if you think there's any doubt, you just have to go back and read the congressional record. That clause is in the federal law because incumbent lawmakers in Congress thought it would stop challengers from attacking them. That's what it comes down to. It's that simple. They said these people had to put their face on an ad and stand up and say, I support that attack on this congressman. They wouldn't do it. Now, Congress might have been wrong about that when they passed that. It doesn't seem to work that way. But that illustrates only two things. One, that they're often wrong on the prospective consequences. And two, what are their intended consequences? Their intended consequences are to harm other people, their challengers. Right? Why would you trust an incumbent congressman to pass laws, right, regulating the electoral process by which he needs to be elected? And that's where that provision comes from. Now people will say, so what's the big deal? That provision takes up about 15% of an ad, 30-second ad, 10 to 15%. You think, well, what can you say in 3 to 5 seconds? You can say lots in 3 to 5 seconds. You say, give me liberty or give me death. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. That's not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you, or maybe it's the other way around, right? You can say, I will never raise your damn taxes. You can say that. I can think of a zillion things you can say that are more helpful to voters than, I'm Brad Smith, and I approve this message. That is probably the least helpful thing I think that you put in an ad, right? So the federal government is commandeering a portion of these ads to require that information to go there. But now they want to go further. They want to do this not only with candidate ads, but with ads that are funded by other groups. So if we have a group come out and the group spends money, the idea is, well, the head of that group should have to appear in the ad, the head of that corporation. I will tell you once again, there is no doubt if you look at the record, the goal here is not to provide the public with information, it is to get those speakers to be silent. Why? Because a lot of speakers don't want to appear on TV, showing their face for that purpose and being identified by them. And we'll get into that. But think about what that does. Is that really what we want? Do we really want to require in our political ads, not just allow, but require in our political ads, a standard that may lead to more emphasis on good-looking people? Everybody likes good-looking people, right? That's why most office holders are at least passively good-looking, right? Very few are really, really dirtbag. I mean, there are few are. Come up with few, but not very many are. Okay? That's the reason I'm not elected politics, right? I think pretty good-looking. Do we really want voters sitting there saying, oh, that's the black guy. Oh, that guy, I think he's gay. Are those really the criteria you want voters deciding on? Maybe they are. But I'm not sure that that's a particularly valid thing. In other words, what is helpful to the public about having these candidates, or not these candidates in this case now, but citizens appear in the ad with their face up to say, I approve this message. The purpose, of course, is to get those groups to be silent. There are, now that begins to lead us to the question then, this is what I call junk disclosure. This is not information that is helpful to the public in making its decisions. And that's really the basis for which we have these laws. So let's think a little bit more then about why people might not want to disclose this information. At the most basic level, it's privacy, right? I mean, that's what I said at the beginning when I gave a little example, right? It's privacy. I believe in our privacy. You ever go, if you go to the opera, you go to the museums, you go to things like that, you go check into the hospital, you'll see gifts from anonymous. Why do people want to do it anonymously? Because they just want their privacy. Sometimes they just don't want the limelight, they don't want other people asking them for money, whatever it is, all right? That is a value in and of itself that we shouldn't just toss aside as if it's not a value. Maybe it's not a very big value. Maybe we should require something more than you just want your privacy, because we think there's this huge government interest in getting that information out there. So I'm suggesting maybe there's not. But it is still a value that we're tossing aside. Now let's take that a little bit further. Let's think about why has this issue been controversial at all, right? If we go way back, there are a series of hard-won Supreme Court decisions providing the right to speak and associate anonymously. And these decisions protect labor union organizers, a case called Thomas v. Collins. They protect picketers, a case called Talley v. California. They protect people of unpopular political parties, Socialist Workers' Party versus the state of Ohio. But a lot of the key cases here, several others, a lot of the key cases here come out of the Civil Rights Movement. In the 1950s and early 1960s, several cases, Button versus Alabama, Bates versus Little Rock. In the key case, NAACP versus Alabama. Okay? NAACP versus Alabama. This is the 1950s case, and the state of Alabama was insistent on finding out who were all the donors to the NAACP. And of course, the public has a right to know. Right? The public has a right to know who's coming down there and trying to influence Alabama politics. Now, you don't have to have been born in Alabama. I assume all of you have enough of a sense to know what life was like in Alabama in the mid-1950s, right? What would happen to the NAACP if all of their donors and member lists had to be made public? They would have very few donors and members very, very quickly, right? It's that simple. I had a guy once challenge, he said, well, but that may be, but that's not true today, you know. He says, besides, if I were there then, I would have stood up and said, proudly, I support the NAACP. I said, would you read it? Are you that sure? Because I said, I'm not that sure I would have had that courage. But my kids going off to school, y'all seen, honestly, Boston, it's like mandatory to graduate, right? The Atticus Finch movie, Killed Mockingbird, right? Remember the guy goes out and assaults his kid, right? That's not like a made up, like totally unrelated to reality. Yeah, it's made up, it's fiction, but it's not, doesn't come out of nowhere that that's a key plot to the story, right? You want the cross burning on your yard? You want to lose your businesses? You want to see your brother Fred fired from his job because you're supporting the NAACP? That how much courage you've got? Maybe for this guy was. He was pretty sure that he was that courageous. A lot of people were not. And so we see that anonymity can become very, very important. Now, is it, you know, most of the country were not NAACP, and it's not the 1950s in Alabama. All right? On the other hand, how much courage should people have to have? Justice Scalia, who is a big supporter of mandatory disclosure, says people got to be tough. Got to tough up and stand by their words. Think how little are the incentives to be engaged in politics and democracy in this country? Not very much. Your vote's not going to decide the election. Your financial contribution is not going to decide the election. Even your activism is going to decide the election. It may help a little bit, but if you just dropped out, who would really care? Right? We're just not that important. The nation of 300 million people. No one of us makes that big a difference. Do we really want to discourage people from participating by knowing you're going to have these taxes? Is it really that far-fetched that at some point in a couple of years maybe we'll see some bombs going off outside financial supporters of Planned Parenthood Action Fund or outside the National Organization for Marriage? Is that really just off the charts? You cannot conceive of that occurring? Because it's not off the charts for me. And when it occurs, we're going to say, where did they get that information? And the answer is going to be they got it from the campaign finance disclosure reports. And the question is going to be, well, why are we requiring these people to disclose that information? And the response will be, because about 4% of money spent in American politics didn't tell us the ultimate name of the donor, only the name of the actual spender. And we were so worked up about that 4% that we overturned all these legal precedents, were narrowed at to the point of irrelevance, precedents that have been built up over a 40-year period of hard-fought efforts. That's what we're going to do. And it's not far-fetched. Out in California, people who supported Proposition 8, which was the state law that made it against the California Constitution, I guess, well, not the law, but the California Constitutional Amendment prohibiting gay marriage. A lot of these people were harassed. Many people were forced to leave their jobs. Some even fled the state. One woman gave, I think it was $100 to the campaign. They boycotted her father's restaurant until she finally left the state because her father was going to go out of business because she spent $100 on this. Now, regardless of what you think about the underlying issue, is this how you think we ought to conduct our politics? Is this what we want in society? And that takes us to, and there are numerous other examples, and many are not even political in this sense. For example, a few years back, a woman named Gigi Brienza all of a sudden got a phone call from the FBI, as did several other people. She's the one who wrote publicly about it, saying, we got some issues here. What was the problem for Gigi Brienza? Well, she'd gone to a John Edwards rally, and he'd given a speech. This was when John Edwards was a credible politician, and she was very inspired by his To America speech, and so she gave him a couple $100. I think it was $500. And a group called Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which has been identified by the FBI as a terrorist organization, used these disclosure database, which requires information on the employer and so on, and used this information to find out all the people they could find who worked for Bristol Myers Squibb. Bristol Myers Squibb is a pharmaceutical company that had contracts with Huntington Animal Labs, and Huntington Animal Labs, according to Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, engages in cruelty to animals, right? So SHAC, as this group is known, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, went out and put up a website that listed the home address of these Bristol Myers Squibb employees and said, now you know where to find them. And just to make sure that you don't think this is a trivial thing, one of the many actual terrorist acts for which SHAC has been convicted, you could say, I'm not sure if they always result in criminal convictions, but found by security forces, were incidents in Britain where they in fact attacked executives of Huntington Animal Labs outside their homes with baseball bats. So again, is this likely to happen? Does this happen to most political contributors? No, it doesn't. Probably not very likely to happen. And this is the cost-benefit analysis that we need to undertake, and that is rarely undertaken. Okay, so I gotta wrap it up here so we can get to questions. So let me add just a few points here to try to answer. Anonymous speech has a long and honored history, for instance. Federalist Papers, Common Sense, right? Made the argument against the king. Okay. The Crisis by Thomas Paine. You know, the crisis, these are the times, the tribe and the souls, the sunshine, patriot, will wit away, and all that stuff, right? Inspiring the troops during the Revolutionary War during the darkest days of Valley Forge. Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, General Winfield Scott, Chief Justice John Marshall, John Adams, all of these people either engaged directly in or financed anonymous political speech. And they did it for a host of reasons to remain anonymous. Some were to maintain social contacts. Some were to be able to make arguments, right, that they thought needed to be made while not endangering their ability to work with other people in the legislature to make compromises at the appropriate moment, and without damaging personal relationships that would make compromises possible. Okay. So there's a lot of reasons why people have always wanted anonymity. Many speakers feel it's more helpful to their message if you're an unpopular speaker. You don't want to be identified with the message, and this is one of the problems with excessive disclosure, right? It cuts off unpopular ideas, right? Because we resign unpopular people don't want to make those speeches. It's a long and honored history in America to engage in some level of anonymous speech. I do still believe, actually, I used to believe more strongly in a lot of disclosure. I do still believe that some disclosure can probably be justified as both a constitutional and a policy matter. But what we have done in the last few years is push the meter, I think, to a point where we're talking about disclosure that is of very little value to anybody. And we're ignoring the cost that it imposes on our society. And if you look at the current push that has gone on for increased disclosure since Citizens United, I would submit to you again that there's very little doubt that this is a partisan effort to silence particular political voices. No longer are the people arguing for this, or at least many people arguing for this, the people driving this, simply saying, I want to know who's financing the speaker so that I can make a good decision about public life. The answer is quite the opposite. That's in the case of Proposition 8, and that's in the case of various other episodes we can talk about. Right? These people are going out there saying, I hate this speech. I know what I think about this speech, and I hate it. And I want to find the person who's making that speech and make their life unpleasant so they will stop doing it. There's a site, for example, called 8 Maps that was done out in California that listed, and you can do this on, actually on a lot of sites, I think Pros and others, right? You can go on, enter who you want to know about political donations, and not only does it pop up with a list of their donations, it pops up with a map to their house. That's just curses. What's the purpose of that? What even, Justice Kennedy's unfortunate dicta in Citizens United aside, what does it mean to say, we're going to hold you accountable for your speech, for non-tortious, that is to say, non-defamatory political speech, legal political speech? What does it mean to say, I'm going to hold you accountable for that? Other than to say, I'm going to try to make your life unpleasant. And this is ripping at our social fabric right now. It's destroying the quality of our political debate. It's killing our ability to talk honestly and openly about politics or anonymously about politics, focusing on the arguments involved. So, for my money, I would say that my point here today is that disclosure is, like most things in life, good and it's got bad. And we need to think about what we're really getting and get past the idea that anything labeled disclosure is inherently good or inherently necessary. We need to recognize that disclosure laws, like other campaign finance laws, are used primarily to try to attack one's political opponents. That's the primary purpose of these laws, is to attack your political opponents on various charges. And that these are not, in fact, improving our democracy at all. And so I would caution us to tread lightly. Thank you.
I was going to make a couple of comments in response, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Sure, that was interesting and thought-provoking. I wanted to say a couple of things about Minnesota's approach to disclosure, because actually last year our approach was to decrease the amount of disclosure that's required in Minnesota by increasing the thresholds for requiring disclosure. Minnesota, actually since probably the 70s when the law came into effect, required major purpose groups, political committees and funds primarily, but candidates as well, to register with the Campaign Finance Board once they raised or spent $100 and to report to the Campaign Finance Board in itemized manner every contribution of more than $100. And the board concluded that that was in fact, that there was not a sufficient state interest in that level of disclosure. So we recommended and the legislature agreed to increase those thresholds in every case. So now a person, and Professor Smith may feel this is token, but for Minnesota it was a pretty big step. A person who wants to run for office, if you don't have a lot of money, you can do anything you want and raise and spend up to $750 and never have any contact with the Campaign Finance Board. So that threshold went from 100 to 750. And even once you do have contact with the Campaign Finance Board and have to register, you won't disclose any donors of less than, they have to be more than $200 instead of more than 100. We made even more changes for independent expenditures because the state's interest in independent spending is really less, I think the courts have recognized, the state at least has recognized, is less because there's no chance of, at least the courts have said, there's no chance of influencing the candidate or getting some quid pro quo. And so independent spenders can raise and spend up to $1,500 without registering or having any contact with the board. And in ballot questions, which we think is the most protected level of speech, you can spend up to $5,000 on a ballot question and again never have any kind of contact with the Campaign Finance Board or any disclosure whatsoever. And even if you exceed that amount, your direct donors will not be disclosed unless they donate more than $500. And that's all just a change in the last year. And of course, particularly in ballot questions, there's a provision for an exemption from itemization, and we did grant one exemption in the last year for itemization for a particular donor in a ballot question case. I agree, voters don't look at disclosure. It's all out there on our website. But who does look at it is candidates and even more political parties. So if candidates and parties know who is speaking against them, they'll be able to respond to that, and the public will know through the candidates' efforts, though the public themselves, I think, seldom looks at our disclosure website. Professor Smith indicates that disclosure is, in part at least, to silence or control particular voices. That's true to some extent. I, this year, can't convince the Democrats to control both bodies and the governorship that better disclosure is somehow going to help them. And in contrast, that must mean not help Republicans as much. The bills won't pass. So every time you have a regulated community, and in this case, disclosure is always regulated by the incumbents. If the incumbents don't agree or don't believe it's going to help them, they're not going to do it. And that's a problem, and it will always be a problem. The questions are philosophical. My board does believe that at least requiring certain other types of communications that I've described be disclosed is prudent and doesn't go too far. Professor Smith makes the point, and it's a very valid one, that even if you get underlying source disclosure, so the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce tells us what businesses donate to them. And actually, that's a bad example. We know that a 501c4 corporation made a donation to an entity in Minnesota. We don't know where they got the money. We're trying to go up one level, but as Professor Smith points out, the next thing is we just go more levels. So that's already happened. So there is some question about whether it's a futile effort at all. We did have one example in 2000, I think it was either 8 or 10, it was 2010 actually, where a group called, the name might be a little bit wrong, but it's a real group. It was something like Minnesota's Economic Future, gave a contribution to a registered political fund. We didn't have underlying source disclosure much in place then, but because other laws that were in place, we were able to go back and find out that Minnesota's Economic Future, which was a 501c4 corporation, was nothing more than one contribution from Twin City Federal, so that did become public. So in that case, going up one level helped, but if we start going up one level and people learn how to play the game, it eventually won't help. So in the end, it's all a question of whether the legislature wants it, and the legislature, it's a question of whether they think it will do them any good and whether there's any constituent pressure. I sort of doubt that there is much constituent pressure. I would say the precedents have already been overturned. Citizens United kind of on disclosure, even though some of its dicta is pretty powerful. There are other parts of dicta that are about the burden of registration that is also very dicta, but is also pretty powerful. But it becomes really a policy decision, and my legislature and that board will struggle with it. And I hope that you weigh in with your legislator if you have an opinion on that.
Do people in the audience have questions for?
I'd like to hear, and I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, the gentleman on the far right. Yeah.
Okay. Smith.
It's Mr. Smith. Mr. Goldsmith presented a question at the end of his initial speech. Maybe he can repeat it, but I'd just be curious to hear your take or your answer to his question. It was about a group influencing a legislature.
One question related to Minnesota Right to Life, whatever it's called here in the state, basically Minnesota Right to Life, having the ability to sort of derail campaign finance legislation. I would put that in the context. First, why does Minnesota Right to Life have that? Because they represent lots of people. And they represent people who are very passionate and who, when they're informed by Minnesota Right to Life, you know, who they like, who they endorse, who they don't endorse, these voters tend to vote that. So their power really reflects, I think, people power to move voters. But why is Right to Life, and this is true all across the country, by the way, and if the national, why are they involved in campaign finance issues? Why would they score that issue? I remember when I first got to the FEC, and I went down into the library. I got a nice law library there. I remember there was this whole shelf of books, right? And I want you to imagine yourself that somebody said to you, you know, I'd like you to tell me everything you can about the Colorado tribe in the Amazon or something, and their ways and mores and how they live and so on. You're like, Colorado, you know. Okay. So you'd start getting books, right? Trying to figure this group out. Right? That's kind of what these shelves were like in the FEC library. There are all these books with titles like, you know, Thunder on the Right, and, you know, God's Christian Country, or, you know, all these things about what was then called the religious right and Christian conservatives. And, you know, I thought most of the lawyers at the FEC, they're good people, and they're not, you know, crazy people or anything else, and they're not ridiculous zealous, and they want to smother everybody's First Amendment rights. But virtually none of them, maybe I should say none of them, but not that many of them go to church, right? They're not a bunch of churchgoers. That's our most people in Washington are not, and most young professionals there are not, right? They're not pro-life, as most are not. Most of them don't know anybody who owns a gun. In other words, the lifestyle of supporters, of a lot of supporters at least, of Right to Life is totally alien to them. They really are like trying to address people from another universe. And Right to Life has, over the years, felt that it faced the brunt of a number of these regulations many times. Sometimes simply because ignorance on the part of bureaucrats as to how they operate, how they do things. sometimes simply because of animosity from bureaucrats, sometimes because of animosity from the elected legislators. If you look through the history of campaign finance cases in the Supreme Court, a surprising number of them involve right-to-life groups. So to me, the right-to-life story, the particular question goes to exactly why we should be very wary of campaign finance regulation generally. In the broader sense, the question, should we be worried about any group that can do that? I go back to emphasizing right-to-life can do that because they need voters. They need voters, and I don't see why we should be all that worried about that. The funny thing is that right-to-life actually is not a big spender as elections go. Their people are not wealthy. Their members have below average incomes on the whole. And so, I think that just shows that it's very complex when you get into the business of trying to decide who's got too much influence and who has too little, and trying to get the idea that you can get rid of influence is just not conceivable nor desirable. I mean, we want people to be involved in government. We want them to try to influence government. Anytime somebody writes a letter to the editor, they're trying to influence government. They're trying to have more influence than the next guy. And I just don't see how we can try to address that.
There's another question that I'd just like to comment. And I generally agree with that. I posed the question without really answering it. And my question that I still am wondering about is really, in that particular case, does disclosure really matter? Because everybody knows what the group stands for, and everybody knows they say that they have 70,000 members. You can look online and find out that their C4 has a budget of $500,000 or $600,000 a year. So the question is, does it matter if really there's $1 million donor that's funding most of that budget, or it's really the 70,000 members? And I don't know the answer to that question, whether that should matter to us or not.
Yeah, one quick point, by the way, I do want to emphasize, because I tend to forget it, that is, I think the interest in disclosure that Mr. Goldsmith has identified are real and important, and I do favor still certain disclosure. I don't oppose all disclosure. And I think that question that he asked is a valid question that people should ask and think about. I've thought about it a lot and come to my conclusion, But I do think these are valid issues and valid discussions, and that's why I say I think much of it is, what worries me sometimes is an almost cavalier attitude a lot of people have toward the question of disclosure.
I guess one thing with piggybacking off of your thought with people in Washington D.C. really don't know what people Christians and gun holders and that kind of stuff. In 2012, my mayor candidate election, the Koch brothers they infiltrated thousands of dollars for one candidate, and my city is a right wing Republican, and voters were kind of asked the question, why are the Koch brothers spending thousands of dollars on a mayor election? And I mean, the Republican lost. So I mean, in that sense, 4% in the national isn't much, but 4% in local elections, I mean, that could be 100% of, because most people don't know. It's how do you respond to that?
Well, it's true. It's not evenly spread across the board, right? Yeah. I mean, it goes into particular races and particular times and places. My general feeling is that office holders should disclose. I do think, by the way, one of the areas I think we need to liberalize the law is to increase the thresholds. Mr. Goldsmith noticed they've been increased here a bit. And to my mind, $750 is still way, way too low. But, I think that, if somebody's going in, this position, I view the purpose of disclosures to help citizens keep track of their elected representatives. It is not to help elected representatives keep track of the citizens. And while it's true that those are often flip sides of the same coin, they don't always have to be. And in evaluating whether it's worth putting that coin into play, we need to really look at that. Who's really going to benefit here? And one of the things I hear all the time from the office holders is, I want to know who's attacking me. I'm like, what do you care? It's a voter. He doesn't like what you're doing, right? Why does it matter whether he learned that from the New York Times or from an ad paid for by the Koch brothers or from his neighbor talking over the fence? He still doesn't like what you're doing, right? And in my mind, these guys want to know precisely so that they can punish the people who are talking against them, who are speaking out against them. That's why they want to know. And I think that's a dangerous possibility. So, to a question like yours, there's sometimes I say, look, I'm not offering nirvana either. I'm saying let's think realistically about what we really need to know and what's really helpful. And do we really want people deciding, well, I'm not going to vote for that guy because it's supported by the Koch brothers? Wouldn't it maybe be better if they said, I'm not gonna support that guy because he favors charter schools and I'm opposed to it?
No, that raises my First Amendment hackles. I have to respond to that. One of the concerns that has motivated an interest in campaign finance regulation is an idea of trying to equalize the playing field, right? Making it a fair fight when one side, which is impossible when one side throws the outspend the other. And that's a rationale that the court has repeatedly rejected, right? I mean, the court has instead said that the only thing that really, or one of the only things that justifies campaign finance regulation is this anti-corruption interest, right? The concern that spenders will have undue influence, or donors will have undue influence on candidates in a quid pro quo relationship. And I mean, Kennedy's statement in Citizens United looked at disclosure as a way to balance unlimited spending, right, to avoid undue influence. But the problem is with although the idea of equalizing the playing field is said to be foreign to the First Amendment because it assumes that less speech is better than more. The First Amendment jurisprudence says that more is better. And if you believe that, then a concern that electors are going to make bad or ill-informed choices, that they're going to, that those aren't the criteria in which people should be voting, that electors are easily swayed or stupid. I mean, those are all really bad reasons, I think, for restricting speech. And disclosure is forced speech. It's sort of the other side of that. But one way to think about it is to think about what it does to balance out unlimited spending, to balance out undue influence. If we're going to have spending, if spending is going to look like speech, we need disclosure to balance out influence. And we don't really, I think, want to investigate whether people are using disclosure to make bad decisions. I mean, I think those, to ask whether those are the criteria on which we want people deciding who they want elected, whether they should be looking at whether the Koch brothers are funding somebody or whether the person they're funding is for or against particular issues, I think is a really dangerous territory to stray into.
Well, of course, I'm advocating that for suggesting that the government should not be requiring forced disclosure.
Right, no, I understand.
And I would suggest that, my basic thing on this too is that people often say, well, I have a right to know. Well, the answer is, you have a right to know what, right? I mean, you have a right to know everything you want to know, because there's lots of stuff you don't know about me, and you don't know about him, and you don't know about Professor Levine, and do you need to know all of these things, or do you have a right to know? And part of it is, remember, we're not talking about, people say, well, I have a right to boycott that company if I don't like how they spend their money on politics. And I'm like, of course you do. That's not the question. The question is, and it's not, you have a right to vote on whatever basis you want. The question is, in the first case, do we want the government forcing a speaker to make sort of an admission against interest that's going to create other problems for them? So the government force them to do that. And the question on the question of how people make voting decisions is, in addition to the sort of strictly constitutional issues, I do think we should sit and make a policy thought as to, is it really that helpful to get this information out there? And of course, one argument is that voters know who's paying for it, and that influences their view. But there is a corresponding counter-policy argument, which is maybe it's not helpful. Maybe that's not the ideal way that, I think a lot of the disclosure tends to lead everything to devolve into ad hominem attacks on folks. And I think you see that more and more in the political discourse that goes on. People immediately, oh, well, Koch brothers pay for that. I can just ignore that ad, or I can attack the person for that reason, or whatever else it is. And I don't think that's healthy. So I do think you're making a policy decision, or at least somebody who's advocating a policy position that we need disclosure. This would be a good policy. And I do think it's legit to argue, no, I think it would be leaving aside constitutional strict concerns, I think it's a bad policy for the constitutional issues we're handling. At least I'm not sure it's good all the time.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Professor Levine for moderating the event. The Federalist Society has a few more events planned this semester. Our next one is March 25th at noon. I believe it's in the Kelly boardroom, but I could clarify that. It's going to be on economic liberty and Lochner, kind of reviving Lochner. Economic liberty having to do with if you want to earn an honest living, the government shouldn't be standing in the way. So we have a Professor David Bernstein of George Mason University, and then Caitlin McBride, who's an attorney at the Institute for Justice. They're going to be discussing how economic liberty can maybe make a revival in states and at the federal level. So thanks again for showing up. We have plenty of food, so please feel free to take some home, bring it downstairs, whatever you want. Thanks again for coming.